Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we revealed the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. Most militarized prison in ADX Florence. Federal control, extreme isolation. There are prisons meant to punish. There are prisons meant to isolate. And then, there is one prison meant to disappear people. No riots. No chaos. No cameras inside. Just silence. And control so absolute it feels military. This is the prison where terrorists, cartel leaders, and mass killers are sent when the federal government decides. You will never be a problem again. This is not a state prison. This is not about rehabilitation. This is about total federal dominance. This is ADX Florence. And what happens here pushes the limits of legality, psychology, and human endurance. Built like a military base. ADX Florence doesn't look like a prison. It looks like a military installation. Reinforced concrete. Multiple perimeter fences. Gun towers positioned like battlefield overwatch. Located in the high desert of Colorado, the isolation is intentional. No nearby cities. No accidental witnesses. No easy access. Everything about ADX Florence sends one message. Control is absolute here. Opened in 1994, ADX was built after the federal government reached a terrifying conclusion. Some inmates were too dangerous for any existing prison, not because they escaped, but because they controlled people from behind bars. ADX Florence was the answer. Who gets sent here? ADX Florence houses inmates the federal system considers uncontainable. Domestic terrorists, international terrorists, cartel kingpins, serial killers, gang leaders who ran empires from prison, men who orchestrated violence with words alone. At ADX, communication is the enemy, and isolation is the weapon. Inmates are sent here indefinitely. No release date. No promise of transfer. No timeline. Some arrive thinking it's temporary. Almost all are wrong. 23 hours alone. Life inside ADX Florence is defined by one number. 23. Inmates spend 23 hours a day alone in a concrete cell roughly the size of a parking space. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. The walls are concrete. The window? A narrow slit designed so you can't see the mountains. Only the sky. Human contact is minimized to the point of extinction. Meals are slid through a slot. Movement is done in chains. Recreation happens alone in concrete enclosures. Silence isn't a side effect. It's the point. But the most extreme part of ADX Florence isn't the cell. It's what this level of isolation does to the human mind. And what happens when the federal government decides that's acceptable. Extreme isolation as policy. At most prisons, solitary confinement is a punishment. At ADX Florence, it's the baseline. This isn't disciplinary segregation. This isn't temporary lockdown. This is permanent isolation by design. Every movement is calculated. Every sound minimized. Every interaction controlled. Inmates are not allowed to walk past each other. They are not allowed to speak to each other. They are not allowed to see each other. When prisoners leave their cells, they're shackled at the wrists, waist, and ankles. Multiple guards escort one man, not because he's violent in that moment, but because the system assumes constant threat. At ADX, the policy isn't about behavior. It's about prevention through total domination. And once you're inside this system, you're no longer managed. You're contained. The psychology of sensory deprivation. The human brain is not built for silence. It needs sound, movement, faces. ADX Florence removes all of it. Psychologists describe sensory deprivation as one of the fastest ways to destabilize the mind. Symptoms appear quickly. Hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, emotional numbness. Inmates begin talking to themselves, then to walls, then to people who aren't there. Time stops behaving normally. Minutes stretch into hours. Days blur together. Years disappear. One former ADX inmate later said, "You stop feeling like a person. You feel like a thought trapped in concrete." Federal officials argue this is necessary, that ADX inmates are uniquely dangerous. But critics argue something darker, that prolonged isolation doesn't neutralize violence. It creates it. The prisoners who tried to break ADX. Some inmates didn't accept ADX quietly. They fought it, through lawsuits, through hunger strikes, through refusing to comply. A handful tried to communicate with the outside world, not to plan crimes, but to prove they still existed. They challenged the constitutionality of permanent isolation, argued it violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Federal courts listened, then ruled against them, because the government's argument was simple. These men are too dangerous for anything else. And danger, the courts decided, justifies extremes. One inmate summarized it best. You can't escape ADX. You can only survive it. And survival here comes at a cost few understand. But isolation doesn't just silence inmates. It hides something else. Deaths, mental collapse, and suicides no one ever sees. Because the quietest prison in America is also the hardest one to hear screaming. Suicide inside the quietest prison. In most prisons, suicide is loud, shouting, emergency alarms, medical teams running. At ADX Florence, suicide happens in silence. Cells are designed to minimize tools. Beds are concrete. Fixtures are flush with walls. And yet, men still find ways. Using bedsheets. Using clothing. Using time. Because the most powerful weapon at ADX isn't violence. It's hopelessness. Former inmates describe days where they never spoke a single word. Weeks where the only sound was their own breathing. Years where no one used their name. Psychologists warn that extreme isolation increases suicide risk dramatically. ADX responded not by reducing isolation, but by monitoring it. More cameras, more observation, same conditions. One former staff member later said, "We could see everything, but we couldn't fix anything." And that distinction matters. Because when prevention becomes observation, the system stops asking why people want to die, and starts asking only when. Hunger strikes and legal challenges. When inmates realize they can't escape ADX physically, they try something else. They starve. Hunger strikes became one of the only ways prisoners could exert control over their own bodies. Not to demand luxury, but to demand contact. More human interaction. More time outside cells. Clear criteria for release from isolation. Federal response was swift and clinical. Medical monitoring increased. Privileges were removed. Force feeding was authorized if necessary. Courts repeatedly ruled that the government had the right to preserve life, even if the conditions causing despair remained unchanged. One inmate wrote in a filing, "They won't let us die, but they won't let us live either." That sentence never appeared in a court ruling, but it echoed through legal challenges for years. The terrorists held in silence. ADX Florence became synonymous with one category of inmate: terrorists, men accused or convicted of acts meant to terrorize entire populations. The federal government believed isolation was the only way to neutralize their influence. No interviews, no communication, no platform. And in many ways it worked. No speeches, no manifestos, no coordinated messaging from inside. But critics asked a dangerous question. At what cost? Because total silence doesn't erase ideology. It just buries it. Some inmates deteriorated rapidly. Others became eerily calm. One former attorney described visiting a client at ADX. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defiant. He was empty. That emptiness is what ADX is designed to produce. Not compliance. Not remorse. but absence. But terrorists weren't the only ones sent to ADX Florence. Some of the most powerful criminal organizations on Earth also ended up here. And when you place absolute isolation against absolute power, something strange happens. Cartel leaders in total lockdown. Cartel leaders are used to control. Even in prison, they find ways to command loyalty, move money, and order violence. That's exactly why the federal government sent them here. At ADX, power is stripped down to nothing. No phone calls. No visits without glass. No contact with other inmates. Cartel leaders, who once commanded armies, were reduced to a single voice, speaking to no one. The goal wasn't punishment. It was decapitation. Cut the head off the organization by isolating it completely. And, in many cases, it worked. Drug networks fractured. Lieutenants fought for control. Operations became chaotic. But isolation had side effects. Some cartel leaders deteriorated psychologically faster than expected. Men who thrived on control collapsed under silence. Others adapted in unsettling ways, becoming hyper-rigid, obsessive, withdrawn. One federal observer noted, they weren't broken by violence. They were broken by nothing happening at all. Communication blackouts. At ADX Florence, communication is treated like contraband. Letters are delayed, screened, sometimes withheld entirely. Phone calls are rare and heavily monitored. Visits happen through thick glass, under strict limits. This isn't just security, it's strategy. Because communication is how influence spreads. ADX cuts those lines deliberately. No casual conversation. No group activities. No shared spaces. Even legal communication is constrained by layers of procedure. Attorneys have described visiting clients who struggled to speak coherently, not because they didn't understand, but because they had forgotten how to converse. The federal position is clear. Silence prevents harm. Critics counter with a harsher truth. Silence also erases people. And when a system is designed to erase, it rarely asks what comes after. Federal lawsuits against ADX. ADX Florence has faced lawsuit after lawsuit. Claims of cruel and unusual punishment. Arguments against indefinite solitary confinement. Challenges based on mental health deterioration. Plaintiffs argued that no human should be subjected to isolation measured in decades. The government's defense was consistent. These inmates are uniquely dangerous. No alternative exists. National security depends on it. Courts largely agreed. Judges deferred to federal authority, especially when terrorism or organized crime was involved. A pattern emerged. The more dangerous the inmate was labeled, the fewer protections they were afforded. One ruling stated plainly, harsh conditions alone do not constitute a constitutional violation. That sentence became the foundation of ADX's existence. And it raised a disturbing question. If extreme isolation is legal for the worst inmates, where does the line actually exist? By now, ADX Florence had proven something powerful, that the federal government could build a place beyond scrutiny, as long as the people inside were frightening enough. But the damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was visible, in the minds of the prisoners. Mental illness behind concrete. ADX Florence was never designed as a mental health facility. Yet over time, it became one. Not because inmates arrived mentally ill, but because the environment created it. Men with no prior diagnosis began showing symptoms within months. Severe anxiety, depression, paranoia, auditory hallucinations. Others spiraled into psychosis. The federal system documented these changes carefully. But documentation didn't equal treatment. Mental health care at ADX is limited by the same principle that governs everything else. Isolation first. Therapy happens through doors. Medication is delivered without conversation. Crisis intervention is observational, not interactive. Former inmates described being watched during breakdowns, but not comforted. One man later said, "They didn't want to help us feel better. They wanted to make sure we didn't die on camera." That line captures the contradiction at the heart of ADX. Preservation without restoration. The guards of ADX Florence. The men and women who work at ADX Florence aren't ordinary prison guards. They're trained for containment. Many come from military backgrounds. Others receive specialized instruction in restraint, escort, and crisis response. Their job isn't to interact. It's to manage risk. Guards rarely speak to inmates beyond commands. Names are avoided. Conversations discouraged. This isn't cruelty. It's policy. Because emotional distance is considered a security measure. But that distance cuts both ways. Former ADX guards described emotional numbness, difficulty relating to people outside work, an inability to relax in quiet spaces. One former officer admitted, "You learn to treat silence as safety, and that messes with you." At ADX, control isn't just enforced on inmates. It reshapes the people enforcing it. Military-style control systems. ADX Florence operates less like a prison and more like a secure military facility. Motion sensors track movement. Cameras cover every angle. Doors are controlled electronically from centralized command rooms. Human error is minimized, not through trust, but through automation. In emergencies, response teams deploy with tactical precision. No shouting, no improvisation, just procedure. This level of control creates an illusion of perfection. But perfection has a price. When systems fail, they fail completely. And when humans are reduced to variables in a control matrix, their suffering becomes data, measured, logged, ignored. Because the system isn't built to ask how someone feels. It's built to ask whether they complied. By this point, ADX Florence had proven it could isolate anyone forever. The question that remained wasn't whether it worked. It was whether it was constitutional, and whether a democracy can justify a place designed to erase people in the name of safety. Is ADX constitutional? ADX Florence exists on a legal knife edge. Every challenge against it eventually reaches the same question. Does permanent isolation violate the Constitution? Specifically, the Eighth Amendment. Cruel and unusual punishment. Attorneys for ADX inmates argue that decades of isolation cause predictable psychological harm, that the damage is permanent, and that no amount of security justification can erase that. The federal government responds with a different argument. National security requires extraordinary measures. Some inmates are too dangerous to house anywhere else. Courts should defer to correctional experts. Time and again, judges sided with the government. Even the Supreme Court of the United States has avoided drawing a clear line, acknowledging the severity of isolation, but stopping short of declaring it unconstitutional. That ambiguity matters, because it means ADX Florence doesn't need to prove it's humane, only that it's necessary. And necessity, in matters of security, is a powerful shield. The prisoners who left broken. A small number of inmates eventually leave ADX Florence. Not freed, but transferred. And when they do, the damage is obvious. Men who spent years speaking to no one struggle to form sentences. Eye contact feels threatening. Crowds feel unbearable. Some develop panic attacks. Others withdraw completely. Former inmates describe a world that feels too loud, too fast, too alive. One man said, "I learned how to survive without people. Nobody taught me how to live with them again." Mental health professionals warn that long-term isolation rewires the brain. Trust erodes. Emotional range narrows. Empathy atrophies. ADX Florence doesn't just punish inmates. It reshapes them. And once reshaped, there's no reset button. Why ADX still exists? By every moral metric, ADX Florence is extreme. By every psychological metric, it's damaging. And yet it remains open. Why? Because ADX solves a problem no other prison can. It neutralizes influence. It silences leadership. It prevents communication. For the federal government, ADX is insurance. Against terrorism. against organized crime, against embarrassment. Closing ADX would force officials to admit something uncomfortable. That extreme isolation was chosen, not because it was the only option, but because it was the most controllable one. ADX exists because it works, not at rehabilitation, but at removal. Removing voices, removing presence, removing risk. And once a system relies on removal, it becomes very hard to imagine alternatives. At this point, the story isn't about whether ADX Florence should exist. It's about what its existence says, about federal power, about fear, and about how far a nation will go to feel safe. What ADX reveals about federal power. ADX Florence reveals something most governments prefer not to say out loud. When fear becomes policy, power expands quietly. No new laws were needed to build ADX. No constitutional amendments passed. No national debate settled the question. The prison emerged through administrative authority, funding decisions, internal policies, security classifications. That's important, because it shows how extreme measures don't arrive with sirens. They arrive with paperwork. Once a system can label someone uniquely dangerous, it can justify almost anything that follows. Indefinite isolation, minimal human contact, psychological damage accepted as collateral. And because the people inside ADX are widely viewed as monsters, public scrutiny fades, oversight weakens, power concentrates. ADX Florence doesn't just control inmates. It demonstrates the federal government's ability to create spaces where ordinary rules bend. Not because they're illegal, but because no one pushes back hard enough. The end game of isolation. The end game of isolation isn't order. It's erasure. ADX Florence doesn't aim to reform. It doesn't aim to heal. It doesn't even aim to punish in the traditional sense. It aims to make people irrelevant. Men sent to ADX are removed from history. No voice. No audience. No impact. From a security standpoint, it's effective. From a human standpoint, it's devastating. Because once a society accepts that some people can be erased, it has to decide who's next. Not tomorrow, not openly, but slowly, through labels, through classifications, through quiet expansions of authority. ADX Florence is the far edge of the system, the place built to answer one question. What happens if we take isolation to its absolute limit? The answer is now concrete. Literally, the silence that remains. ADX Florence still stands. Quiet, remote, unmoving. Inside, men continue to live in near total isolation. Day after day, year after year. The prison doesn't ask whether they can change. It doesn't ask whether they've paid their debt. It asks only one thing. Can they ever be trusted again? And once the answer becomes no, there is no way back. The most unsettling thing about ADX Florence isn't that it exists. It's that it makes perfect sense. In a world where fear is easier to manage than understanding, isolation solved the problem, at a cost. If this story disturbed you, it was meant to. Because ADX Florence isn't just about prisoners. It's about how much power we're willing to hand over when we're afraid. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay locked in. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. Remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.